Okay, great. Welcome to everybody. Good evening. My name is Rabbi Schonbuch. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist based in Brooklyn and around the world via Skype. I'm also a contributor to Hidabroot.com, and many of my videos have been circulating on the internet the last few months with Hidabroot, but for many years I've been broadcasting many different videos, TorahCafe.com and other places around the world. So many of you may have seen my work, or maybe most recently found out about my lecture series. Some of it's based upon my new book called Think Good and It Will Be Good, spiritually based therapy inspired by Viktor Frankl and Jewish wisdom. What's going to be special about this first night of hopefully many nights here, evenings in this community, is not just a shiur on psychology and Torah, but also a chance to answer your questions or ask your questions that I could answer on anything relating to psychology, family therapy, relationships. For those of you who don't know me, I began to specialize many years ago in marriage therapy, so I work with many couples doing marriage therapy. I also work with individuals dealing with anxiety, depression, OCD, and so on. I also specialize in treating trauma with something called EMDR, and many other things. So if you have any questions, what I'd like to do is, the majority of this class will be in a discussion as well, to answer questions, to talk about, to offer opportunities for you to ask questions. I can answer as many questions as we can for the evening on any question relating to marriage, relationships, dating, emotional difficulties and distress. So I hope to kind of combine Torah with psychology for here. So we'll give lots of time for that tonight as well. But I'd like to begin tonight discussing a concept which was noted by the Tzemach Tzedek a long time ago, over 200 years ago, where he said, Trach gut wenn sei gut, think good and it will be good. Very famous term in psychology. I decided to write a book on this topic because I was very influenced by the positive psychology movement, and I found its roots to be in the Torah. So I decided to write a book to help people to think more positive thoughts in their lives. And so I wrote this book. And you know, sometimes when you write a book, Kadosh Baruch Hu, of course, will help you if it's the right type of book. And so along the way, I started putting together a lot of ideas and writing about them. And the ideas are also based upon things that I've experienced in therapy with people over the years. This is not just coming as an idea, but real life therapy with hundreds and maybe thousands of people over the years, how I've helped them, and how these ideas, I try to bring the Torah ideas into the therapeutic environment to help people in a very profound way. So I want to just start with two stories which summarize what the book is all about. Two very powerful stories. And the first story, the most inspirational idea on thinking positively, comes from a Holocaust survivor named Dr. Viktor Frankl. Many of you have probably heard of his name before. Dr. Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote this just after the Holocaust. Frankl was a survivor of several concentration camps. In the camps, he lost his wife, he lost his parents, and he barely survived. But he lived through these camps to describe his experiences in a book called Man's Search for Meaning, where he gives the history of what happened in Auschwitz, perhaps for the first time for many readers around the world. He actually wrote this book and didn't put his name on it. He was such an anav, he was so modest that he said, this is not for me, this is my people that were murdered in the camps. But his friend said, you have to put your name on it, or no one will continue to read it and spread it unless you have a person behind it. They have to have a doctor behind it. So he eventually put his name on it. So Frankl experienced tremendous suffering in the camps. And despite his suffering, he talked about how he overcame his suffering. It's a misnomer to believe, if anybody studied Viktor Frankl's works, that his ideas came from the concentration camps. It's not true. His ideas came before the concentration camps. In fact, another very famous book, not as well read as Man's Search for Meaning, it's a little bit harder. It's not for beginners. It's called The Doctor and the Soul. He wrote way before the concentration camps. And it turns out that when he got to Auschwitz, he had it in his pocket. He took his manuscript with him to Auschwitz. That's all he had left. And the first thing the Nazis did was they took away his manuscript from him, and they burnt it. But this actually turned out to save his life. Why? And you'll see his essential idea emerging from the actual story that happened to him and why man's search for meaning is so important. He was dying one night of a disease called typhus. Typhus is a disease which is spread by lice in the camps. And one of the things which happens when you get typhus is many people develop a very high fever, 103, 104, 105. And he developed typhus in the camps in Auschwitz. And he knew at the time, as a physician, that if he would fall asleep that night with a high fever, he would experience cardiovascular collapse. He would have a heart attack and die. So he forced himself awake until his fever would break. And he survived. But how did he force himself awake? What he did was, he got little scraps of paper. And, you know, you weren't allowed to have paper in the camps, but you could barter for it and give a piece of bread for a piece of paper or something. He got some scraps of paper together. And what he did is he recreated his book that night on those scraps of paper. And it kept him awake. It saved his life. Now, what did he teach us in the camps? And what was his message from that story? His message was that those in the camps that had an orientation towards the future, that believed, and they didn't know if it would be true or not, but at least believed that they would fulfill a future meaning in their lives, a purpose in their lives, had a greater chance of surviving the concentration camps. Now, this, in fact, was a very controversial statement. If you believed you would have a meaning, you would survive. Of course, you had no control whether the Nazis would kill you or not. But he said you had one area of control. And here was his main point. The last of all human freedoms is your ability to choose your attitude when facing inescapable suffering. This is a remarkable concept. The Nazis could take away your body, they could take away your food, they could take away everything you had. But one thing they could not take away from you, that one human freedom, was your attitude towards them and towards your suffering. So his first message, and this is the first message of Think Good, It Will Be Good, is to live towards a higher meaning in your life. In fact, Viktor Frankl also said that those who get up in the morning and say, I want to be happy, will never be happy. You cannot pursue happiness, according to Viktor Frankl. You need to pursue meaning. When you pursue something meaningful, what does he mean by meaning? When you love somebody else, that's an act of meaning. When you study something higher than yourself, something greater like the Torah, that's an act of meaning. When you experience the Kadosh Baruch Hu in the world, and he talks about this in his books, when you go out and you look at mountains, and look at the sun, and you gaze up at the stars, like the Rambam says. You look up in the stars. In Hilchos Deos, you are in awe of what you see in the universe, and you jump back and you see yourselves as a Bria Shefela Katana, a small little speck of dust in the universe, and you're in awe of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Viktor Frankl talked about the same thing. That is also an act of meaning. So he says, when you pursue meaning in your life, happiness ensues. It follows you. So the goal is not to say, I want to be happy. The goal is to say, what meaning can I fulfill? And the present's going to be happiness. Story number one. The second story is a true story from a mother who I interviewed for my book, Mrs. Sosunkin, who now lives in Eretz Israel, but she's from New York. And 1994, a group of young Bachrim yeshiva students were crossing across the Brooklyn Bridge, and an Arab Lebanese terrorist got up and he started shooting the van. Very famous story. And one young man was killed, Ari Halberstam. Now, why do you know that name? Because when you drive from the FDR and you're going to the Brooklyn Bridge, it's called the Ari Halberstam Bridge, or ramp. That was named, I think, by the mayor at the time named it so. But he was the young man who was murdered in that terrorist incident. But another young man, Nachum Sosunkin, was shot also, but he was shot in the head. And he was rushed to the hospital, and he was still conscious. But when he got there, he was suffering such internal bleeding in his brain that he went into a coma, and they rushed him into surgery, immediate surgery, emergency surgery. And they had to remove a piece of his brain just to keep him alive, remove the pressure on his brain. And he went into a coma at that point. The doctor was asked, what is the chance of him living or surviving the surgery and having a meaningful life? And the answer is, I believe, he said 1 in 20, meaning 5% chance this man would actually live. He'd never seen anybody actually live such an injury and survive. So what happened at this point? At that moment, his mother thought about it, and she got up on television, and to the bewilderment of everyone on TV and all the doctors listening to this interview, she invited everyone to her son's wedding. Says, I want everyone here to come and celebrate at my son's wedding. Well, Baruch Hashem, the story goes, the true story, is that Nachum Susankin lived, and he went on to have a beautiful family, and his beautiful children as well. And I asked his mother, what gave you the power? What gave you the power to overcome such a tremendous potential tragedy in your life, to invite everybody to your son's wedding, despite his brain injury? And she said the concept of think good and it will be good. Think good and it will be good means that our minds have the power to affect reality. Our minds have the ability to affect reality. But I want to be very careful here. This statement of Trach Gut und Sei Gut comes from the Tzemach Tzedek. And I want to be careful because I don't want it to be misused by people just about positive thinking. It's not just about the positive thinking movement he was talking about. But I want to share with you, what did the Tzemach Tzedek taught? What did he mean? Think good and it will be good. He described this on 2 levels. The first level, it says in the Torah, Ki teitze l'milchama, when you go out to war, Ver'isa, and you see an Am Rav Mimcha, you see a nation greater than you. Sus v'rechav, you see a horse and a chariot and this great nation, and you're in tremendous fear, and you want to run back. He said, Lo tira, ki ani Hashem Elokecha, hamalacha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God that took you out of the land of Egypt. So the Tzemach Tzedek asked a question. How is it possible that you can't be scared when you're in war? Who goes out to war who's not scared? I'm sure you've met your family members or cousins in Eretz Yisrael or here that have been in the war and been in the army. Who's not scared in the army? A fool. Everybody feels fear in the war, in an army. So how could the Torah be commanding, asked the Tzemach Tzedek, how could the Torah be commanding you to not do something which you're just going to do instinctively? So he says the Torah cannot mean that. Rather, he says, it's not that you can not feel fear. Rather, despite your fear, you distract yourself from your fearful thoughts. And therefore he says, and this was the concept of treating anxiety, long before the university system invented therapy for anxiety or depression, there's something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which I'll talk about in a minute. Long before the cognitive behavioral therapy movement, which started in the 1960s by Aaron Beck, talking 150 years before this, the Tzemach Tzedek said, one has to distract one's thoughts from their own fears. One has to not pay attention to them. That means that one cannot eliminate one's fears easily. Rather, they should distract and focus on positive thoughts. And he gives many eitzot, many directives, how to experience happiness. Tell a joke, have a discussion with somebody you enjoy speaking to. He said, of course, learning Torah is the greatest way to experience simcha in life. Do things which arouse joy in yourself in order to avoid your states of anxiety. He also gives many etzot. For example, he quotes from Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak, and the Ramak, who lived, as you may know, in the 1500s, the time just before the Ari, he gave a meditation on colors. Now this meditation on colors that I actually write in the book was translated by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan and rarely seen, but the Tzemach Tzedek mentioned it. I thought it was important to put it into his book. It's a meditation on colors that you could look into the book or into Aryeh Kaplan's book to learn how to meditate. Eventually he wants you to think about the color white, going through a beautiful garden and eventually experience the color white. He says one should wear white. The Tzemach Tzedek mentions this. One should think about the color white, and this would arouse a state of simcha. It's interesting to note, he also mentions, the Tzemach Tzedek, that one should also think about water when one wants to calm down. Meditate on water, especially when you want to fall asleep. You know, they have these modern apps today where you listen to water flowing. And he was already talking about this 200 years ago. That was the first point of the Tzemach Tzedek, to distract yourself from negative thoughts, to fill your mind with positive thoughts. That's why I call the book Think Good, It Will Be Good. But there's a deeper insight I want to share with you. The deeper insight comes from Chelik Lamed Aleph. Tonight's the Yortzeit of Menachem Mendel Schneerson Lubavitch Rabbi. He asks the question on the Tzemach Tzedek's writings, because there's another story, which is more like the Nachum Susankin story, which is commonly told, that a father came to the Tzemach Tzedek, and his son was dying with a terrible illness, and he didn't know what to do. And the Tzemach Tzedek answered him. He said, "Trach gut und sein good. Think good, it will be good." And the story says that when he started thinking positively, his son got better. But he asked the question, what does it really mean? What is Trach gut und sein? How could it be that you think something good and something good will come out of it? How is that possible? He believes that from the direction of the Chovot Halvavot, the duties of the heart. The duties of the heart describes as follows, and he says that a person needs to believe in a Kadosh Baruch Hu as if they're an Eved, a slave, in a ditch, in a dungeon, locked up. And only his master can take him out of that ditch. The Chovot Halvavot talks about, and there's something called the Shar Bitachon, the gate of trust. He believes that a person needs to work deeply on inculcating himself or herself with the concept of tremendous bitachon, tremendous trust. What's the difference? Emunah, he says, is a belief in God. Believe there's one God, there's one Kadosh Baruch Hu. Bitachon is something much deeper, it's much more internalized. Not that I just believe in God, I believe that God is personally involved with my life at every moment. And he explains, just like the slave knows that the only way out of this pit is to call out to his master, he says, when we believe in a Kadosh Baruch Hu, when we turn to him and say, there's no one except you, Ein od milvado, there's nothing else besides you, I've tried everything else. Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's up to you. I'm here for you. No one else can remove me from this difficulty or changes. He says that Kadosh Baruch Hu also gives of himself kaviyachol. He also gives him himself and will actually change reality for the person. This is, of course, a remarkable idea and a bit, I would say, controversial as well. But it's important to note that our rabbis mention the importance of this idea of turning to Kadosh Baruch Hu, giving him everything and say, I'm here only for you. I've actually tested this out on these two ideas on a psychological level many times with people. I first of all have tried to treat people saying, here are some techniques to kind of distract yourself from anxiety. Let me give you some distraction techniques. If anybody experiences anxiety and wants to help themselves from it, and of course most of us experience anxiety at some time in our lives, right? It's part of human nature to experience anxiety. But some people experience anxiety, as I've seen therapeutically, for a long time. It's not just they're a little bit scared of something, they're always scared. It's called generalized anxiety disorder. So let me just give you a distraction technique that I find very effective. It turns out that there's two parts of your brain. There's the right side of the brain and there's the left side of the brain. The right side of the brain is the seat of imagination and creativity. That tends to be, according to science, on the right side of your brain. The left side of your brain tends to be the side of logic. You can remember that easily, left for logic of your brain. So anxiety primarily exists in the right side, in the side of imagination. What is anxiety except imagination? Do you understand that point? What is it besides you're imagining things turning out as a disaster? How many people have experienced, I can't say it, I mean, almost everybody has unfortunately believed that things would not turn out the way they wanted them to. They were going to turn out disastrously. It turns out in cognitive behavioral therapy, we call this a thinking trap. There's several thinking traps. One of the thinking traps people do when they have anxiety is they do something called fortune telling. Fortune telling means I predict the future negatively. I predict it negatively. But to predict it negatively It takes a tremendous amount of imagination. This will happen, that won't turn out well, and this person will say that thing, and this person won't like me. It's a tremendously imaginative process, real anxiety. So just like the Tzemach Tzedek says, this concept is now understood in psychology. One has to shift one's brain from the right side to the left side. So I'm going to give you a technique you can share with everyone that really works. You know, they say, don't try this at home. You can try this one at home. Try it at home. Very easy. All you need to do when you're feeling anxious is to do some math. Now, how many of you here love doing math? One person. Well, that's good, because I don't want you to love doing math. If you love doing math, this would be too easy. If you tell me you love math, I'll give you some harder math, like calculus. But for most people, don't like math, right? Why don't you like math? Do you know why? It's hard. You have to think. It's not very creative math. Unless you're studying theoretical mathematics, math is very hard for certain people. However, if it's hard for you, great. So I want you to do this simple technique if you're feeling anxious, and you're following the directive of the Tzemach Tzedek. I want you to start from 100. I want you to count backwards by 7, out loud. So you go 100, 93. Right? I want you to count back 7, 7, 7. 86, 79, 90. I've done this many times with people, so it's easier. 72. If I was nervous, I wouldn't do this. 65. I want you to count backwards. And I can do this experiment with you. I want you to get extremely anxious right now. Get really worried, terribly worried right now about something. As you get worried, I want you to count backwards from 100 by 7. And if that's too easy, let me make this easier. Let me make it a little harder, actually.
5. Make it 5.
No, that's too easy. That's too easy. I want to make it hard. 7's hard, yeah?
But how do you both thoughts coexist, even if it's easy? If you're focusing on the math, how do you focus?
Well, if you do it by route and you go, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, or 95, 80, you even go backwards. It's going to be too... I want it to be hard so your mind has to sync itself, focus on really hard. You have to really... I want you to experience concentration. Okay?
Count forward.
What? Count forward. So I give people a number. I say, pick a number, a random number. Pick a number like, 2,426. And then count back by 7. That's a little harder, but you can actually do it. Just go really slowly. But what happens is, I almost guarantee you scientifically, even if you're very anxious, if you're really concentrating on math, it will reduce your anxiety. This is what the Tzemach Tzedek was saying. If you distract your mind from your imagination and go to pure logic and reason, you will see a reduction of your anxiety states. So it's an extreme. Now, I've changed this over the years, and because I'm both a rabbi and a psychologist, I can play with this. So one of the exercises I give people is I tell them to use gematrias. And for those that don't know, I'm sure most of you know, but those who don't, a gematria means every Hebrew letter has a number. So Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Chaf is 20, Lamed is 30, and so on. So here's a great technique, and it could be a Torah experience while you're reducing your anxiety. Look at any object if you're nervous, and add up its numbers. So you can add up kos, if you like, 20, 6, and 60. Add the numbers up, you'll come to a number. You could take a book, you could say Sefer, right? Add up the word Sefer, and so on and so on. And if you really want a challenge, you could add up together Sefer and kos, and a few other objects. But if you look at objects and turn them into mathematics, you'll see your mind just moves towards the logical side and is able to reduce its anxiety. So here's the answer. You should take a math book one level beyond what you studied in school if it's challenging. And I think that will help you, honestly. And I've told a lot of my patients to start studying math if they're very anxious. But here you see the psychology of the Torah manifest, revealed many years later. And I can tell you one of the most important strategies that we learn as psychologists to help people reduce anxiety is this concept of distraction. So this is extremely important. Just a simple lesson today on how to reduce some of your anxiety. So we know about distraction. We know about this concept of thinking positively. There are people that, despite this technique, despite using logic, they suffer from extreme anxiety, we call general anxiety disorder, GAD. Or worse, they suffer from something called OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which I actually specialize in treating. And for somebody that has severe OCD, their life is really overwhelming. About 2% of the population has OCD. So every you say with 100 people, 2 people probably have some form of it. But there's minor OCD and there's major OCD. Some people, what would be a little OCD? You check your door a few times at night before you go to sleep. Once isn't enough. Minor OCD does that a little bit. We all of us, I found, have little OCDs. So don't be worried if you do that a little bit. But some people will check the door 100 times before they go to sleep. That's more severe, right? The more common OCD is people washing their hands a lot, right? That's the classic. You watch a movie about somebody with OCD, they're washing their hands in the movie. So that's a common OCD. But OCD could be slight, but it could be very powerful. It could be so debilitating that people start hoarding, or you can't leave their homes and they can't function properly. So I treat these people as well. And we do distraction techniques. We do something called exposure therapy, which I'm not going to talk a lot about tonight. But sometimes therapy doesn't fully work. Sometimes therapy doesn't work. And we have to go to the next step. We have to go a little bit further. And that's actually why I wrote this book. Because I believed that therapy has its limitations. Therapy is limited. And if you ask people that have been to therapists, some people, Baruch Hashem, found good therapists. Some people have found average therapists. By the way, you don't always find the right therapist. It's like finding a shidduch. It's hard sometimes. But even people who found good therapists will still report to me and to others, there's something missing even after they've gone through psychologists and treatment. There's just something missing from that experience. I write about 3 stories in my book of people that also experience this. Well, they went for cognitive behavioral therapy, they went for EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, deals with trauma. They've gone for Freudian psychoanalysis. They've done a lot of stuff. They've tried tapping, all types of things you probably know about out there. They've done it all, but they're still feeling depressed. They've even taken medication. And here's the news. Medication doesn't always work. Medication is a broad stroke, and there's side effects at times. By the way, I'm not against medication when necessary. Somebody's not functioning well, somebody's really ill, they need medication to get better, specifically with severe depression medications necessary and other things, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. But many people that are in between and just try medication, many report that they're just not satisfied with their medicines. It's not working. So I believe we have to do something beyond therapy with people. And it turns out that's exactly what Viktor Frankl believed. And this is a major point I talk about in the book, and I'll be talking weekly about this concept as we continue to study psychology and the Torah and so on, is that therapy has its limitations. Now, I'm not the only one that's noticed this. A very famous psychologist, a PhD psychologist, Margaret Wernberg, wrote this very point. And she believes, as I do, that there's 2 types of presentations you'll see that people suffer with. Some people have what we call situational problems, anxiety or depression, while other people have more chronic difficulties in their life. What's the difference? What's a situational versus a chronic? The situational thing is, I fail a test and I feel depressed. That's a situational thing. We know what happened. Then the person has to get over their failure, and have to pick themselves up, and they have to go forward. That's situational, but it goes away. There's other things that people experience which we call are chronic. Some people have a lot of fear their whole lives, or suffer from depression their whole lives, or a lot of over-emotionalization, borderline personality. There's people that suffer with many types of things out there. And it turns out, according to Margaret Wernberg, that therapy also doesn't fully work for certain people. But what does she say they need? And this is what I believe is good psychologists are coming to this awareness as well. She writes that people, what they really need beyond therapy is a daily meditative experience with prayer and spirituality. Remarkable. They finally admitted it. What she's saying is, therapy is not enough, and it's not fair to tell our clients that therapy is going to cure everything. They need something greater. And that's why I wrote this book. I brought Torah psychology, I'm hoping to bring Torah psychology with my book, into the world of therapy by using the writings of Viktor Frankl and great Torah scholars like the Tzemach Tzedek and many others to show that the Torah actually can augment and improve therapy if used properly. If used wisely, the Torah has many incredible insights into how we can improve ourselves and how we can be happier and how can we think more positive thoughts. That was the main point I wrote my book for, and I called it spiritually based therapy, because while using the Torah, we could develop a more comprehensive therapy that hasn't existed before. And that's, by the way, exactly what Viktor Frankl said. I'm assuming many of you are not students of Viktor Frankl. You might have read his work. But Viktor Frankl fought a tremendous battle as a psychologist. You probably just know his work, Man's Search for Meaning. But what you didn't know if you didn't study psychology is nobody in the world of psychology talks about Viktor Frankl, including the universities I went to and the master's programs I did and the colleges I went to. Viktor Frankl was never mentioned in anything ever that I studied in psychology. He was a footnote of a footnote somewhere in some book. He wasn't one of the main therapies that we study today. So we're going to therapists today. They're not really studying Viktor Frankl unless they're lucky. Most have studied, well, they used to study Sigmund Freud. They would study cognitive behavioral therapy. They would study EMDR would be a common therapy. They would study Carl Rogers, which is what we call client-focused therapy, a lot of reflection, a lot of validation towards the client, very warm, supportive therapy. But few have ever studied Viktor Frankl. Do you know why? Because Viktor Frankl went to war against most modern psychology. He disagreed with it. He actually believed that if a person focuses too much on him or herself, it causes more emotional distress. He called this concept hyper-reflection. So he believed, paradoxically, if you do too much therapy, you get worse. That's what he said. He said this in the 1920s. And Sigmund Freud went crazy. This is public knowledge, well documented. Sigmund Freud threw him out of his institute, of his Society of Psychoanalysts. He then went to Adler. Now, let me just mention why he also said that. Sigmund Freud said that the essential drive of a human being is what he called the id. And many of you probably heard this word, the id. The id, according to Freud, was, he says, man is like an animal who has these animalistic drives for pleasure. That's what drives the human being. Alfred Adler, the second great psychiatrist in Germany at the time, Vienna and Austria as well, said that that's not true. The essential drive of a human being is power. People want to be powerful, and that's why a lot of parenting books that you've read today many years later are all based on empowering children, you know, the concept of empowerment, and giving them extracurricular activities and complimenting them even if they're not doing well. That all comes from Alfred Adler, that concept. He also introduced to us this idea of family placement in psychology. I often ask clients, what number child are you? Right? That's because of Alfred Adler. He believed in the middle child syndrome. You've heard of the middle? Everybody's heard of the middle, right? This is all Alfred Adler. You didn't know it was from Alfred Adler. He said well, by the way, it's interesting. People ask me because I counsel people from many different communities, from Crown Heights to Flatbush to Borough Park to Williamsburg, and some of the families come to me and they have 15 children. So the question is, which is number 2? Is number 17, is number 13 also the number 2 child in the family system? And I don't believe there's a specific answer, and you know why? Because all these studies were done in the non-religious world and everybody had 2 kids or 3 kids, so they can only look at 3 kids. So there weren't many studies done on 15 people in a family. But I think middle children could exist later on as well. But why does the middle child suffer, as an aside? The middle child suffers because when the first child is born, he or she is the king or the queen. That's why, by the way, I have a Torah insight in a second, I'll give you in a minute. But they're the king or the queen. Then the little number 2 comes along, cute little baby, right? But number 1's not very happy because he or she has lost his or her pedestal. They've knocked off her pedestal. But let's just go for the boy. So he regains the pedestal afterwards. He becomes king. Number 2 kind of fits in line with him, falls in line to survive number 1. But then what happens? Number 3 comes along. Oh boy. When 3 comes along, it shakes the world of number 1 because he has his attention. He gains it back. But 3 is a cute little baby. Cute little baby. But number 2 suffers because he's not the Bechor and he's not the cute little baby. So they're lost. So a lot of children who I've treated who are teens at risk, many of them are second children. You're going to start thinking, is that true? You may find it to be true. You may find that second children, teens at risk, are not second children too. So, but I'm telling you, it is a theory I have that many of them have suffered because they are second children. They're kind of the lost children. But going back to Adler, he said that a human being's drive is for power, and if their search for power is frustrated, then they turn towards negative behaviors and acting out and so on, depression, anxiety. Viktor Frankl came along and says it's not true. Well, it may be true on a surface level, but there's a deeper, more fundamental drive that a human being has, which is what? Search for meaning. And he said a tremendous hop. He said, if a person's search for meaning is frustrated, they don't find purpose in their life. Then they fall down to power and to pleasure. But it's not the essential drive of the human being. It's a secondary drive. So what is it teaching us? Number one, we have to give our children and ourselves. We have to find a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning in our lives. And that's why he had a problem with therapy. Too much focus on the self, said Viktor Frankl, which is Adler and Freud, was what he said stimulated what he called hyper-reflection. Too much focus. We have to go beyond ourselves. And he gives a beautiful mashal. He says, a person can't reach behind his back and pull himself up. You can't pull yourself up higher. You need something higher than yourselves. You need something greater than yourselves to aspire towards, and then you could go up. That was Viktor Frankl's mashal. And therefore he challenged all psychology, and therefore no one was interested in him, because they were going in an absolutely opposite direction. They were talking more about the self. Let me be careful. There's a lot of chokhmah in psychology as well. Cognitive behavior therapy is a remarkable therapy. It talks about your thoughts, affecting your feelings, extremely helpful. In fact, in Kabbalistic and Hasidic thought, there's a lot of structures about first you have thoughts and your feelings and your actions, chokhmah and so on. So he was right on in cognitive behavioral therapy. But Freud and cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDR, if they don't focus, which they don't by the way, on finding a higher sense of purpose in your life to pull you beyond yourself, they're lacking. There's something lacking from that. So according to Frankl, we have to presuppose that a person has deep inside of him or her a deep search for meaning. We have to help them discover that meaning therapeutically as well. We have to challenge them to find more meaning. And therefore, introducing into psychology the Torah, introducing spiritual concepts will be extremely helpful for people. In fact, I believe it balances out the two different sides. You need to work on the self, and that's okay. Freud, Adler, everybody else. You also have to work on the other side, the spiritual dimension of a human being. Frankl called that spiritual dimension nuos, which means meaning. You have to go into the world of nuos, what we call the world of the Torah, the world of ruchniut, the world of spirituality, to complete the therapeutic process. And therefore they go hand in hand. Both psychology and Torah complete the person, can help them above. And both are necessary to improve people's lives, especially if they suffer from anxiety, depression, on a chronic level, or for all of us for that matter. Whatever we struggle with, we can look towards psychology for help. We have to find also meaning in the Torah. And this is the first night of hopefully many, many lectures with you, but I'm just introducing this concept. We will be discussing psychological insights and Torah insights, how this can all come together, and how we could help people improve their lives more effectively.